The Boeing 737 shuddered through another pocket of turbulence, coffee cups rattling against tray tables as passengers gripped their armrests with white knuckles. Captain Martinez's voice crackled through the intercom, steady, but carrying an edge that made seasoned travelers look up from their magazines. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our navigation systems. If there are any licensed pilots aboard this aircraft, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately. In row 12, middle seat, a woman with prematurely silver hair and calloused hands didn't move. Kestrel Vance kept her eyes fixed on the paperback thriller in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. The tremor in her left hand, barely visible to anyone else, pressed against her thigh as another wave of turbulence rolled through the cabin. Around her, passengers murmured nervously, craning their necks to see if anyone would stand. "Ma'am," the flight attendant's voice was polite but insistent as she leaned over the businessman in the aisle seat. "The gentleman in 8C mentioned, he thought he heard you mention flying experience earlier." Kestrel's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She could feel the weight of expectation settling over the cabin like a heavy blanket, the way it always did when people discovered what she used to do for a living. 23 years in the Air Force, 2 tours over Afghanistan, and a distinguished flying cross gathering dust in her apartment closet, but what they'd remember was the headlines from 3 years ago. The court-martial, the grounding, the disgrace. "I fly small aircraft," she said quietly, not looking up from her book. "This is a commercial airliner." The flight attendant's smile grew strained. "Captain Martinez would still appreciate speaking with you, if you don't mind." Through the aircraft's windows, storm clouds pressed against the glass like gnarled fingers. The GPS display on nearby passenger screens flickered between position unknown and blank static. Somewhere in the cockpit, warning lights painted the instrument panel in shades of amber and red, while 2 pilots fought with systems that had suddenly forgotten where they were flying 37,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies. The businessman in the aisle seat cleared his throat. "Look, lady, if you know how to fly, maybe you should." "I said I fly small aircraft." Kestrel's voice carried a finality that made him sink back into his seat, but her hand had stopped trembling, and for the first time since takeoff, she was listening to the subtle changes in engine pitch, the way the aircraft's nose wandered slightly left of center, the almost imperceptible vibration that suggested the autopilot was fighting crosswinds it couldn't quite calculate. She closed the book and looked toward the front of the cabin, where the cockpit door remained firmly shut against whatever crisis was unfolding behind it. The flight attendant was already moving toward first class when Kestrel finally spoke. "Tell Captain Martinez that Major Vance will be right up." The words tasted like copper pennies and old regret, but they were true. Some things you never really stop being, no matter how hard you try to forget. Heads turned throughout the cabin as she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movements carrying the unconscious precision of someone who had spent decades translating split-second decisions into life-or-death outcomes. The businessman stared openly now, recognition dawning slowly across his features. He'd heard that name before, probably attached to news reports about frozen altimeters and congressional hearings. But Kestrel was already walking toward the front of the aircraft, her mind automatically cataloging the subtle signs of system failure that civilian passengers couldn't recognize. The way the cabin lights flickered when the engines changed pitch, the irregular rhythm of the air conditioning cycling, the fact that the captain hadn't made any announcements about their destination or estimated arrival time in the past 40 minutes. She knocked twice on the cockpit door, waited for the electronic lock to disengage, and stepped into chaos. Captain Martinez looked up from a navigation display showing nothing but static and crossed vectors that led nowhere. His co-pilot, younger and visibly sweating, was cycling through radio frequencies with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew they were running out of options. Both men's eyes fixed on Kestrel with a particular combination of hope and skepticism that she remembered from too many emergency briefings. "Major Vance retired," she said, settling into the observer's seat behind Martinez without being invited. "What's your situation?" "Complete nav failure about 15 minutes ago," Martinez replied, gesturing at the dark screen surrounding them. "GPS is down, INS is giving us garbage data, and we just lost contact with Denver Center. Storm system came out of nowhere and we're flying blind in Class A airspace with 237 souls on board." Kestrel's eyes swept the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, noting the failed systems, the backup instruments still functioning, the fuel flow indicators showing slightly higher consumption than normal, indicating they were fighting headwinds the weather radar couldn't properly map. Her hands remained folded in her lap, but every instinct screamed at her to reach for the controls. "How's your compass?" she asked quietly. "Mechanical backup is still good," the co-pilot answered, glancing over his shoulder. "But without position reference, we're just maintaining heading and altitude." "And you've tried switching to manual navigation?" Martinez's expression tightened. "Ma'am, with respect, this isn't a Cessna. We need precision approach guidance to get this aircraft on the ground safely, and right now we don't even know which state we're flying over." Kestrel nodded slowly, her gaze fixing on the small digital display showing their altitude, 37,000 feet and holding steady. Outside the cockpit windows, the storm pressed against them with the weight of an ocean, lightning flickering through layers of cloud like electric synapses. Below that storm, somewhere in the darkness, lay the mountains and valleys of Colorado, invisible but waiting. She thought about the last time she'd flown in weather like this, over the Hindu Kush mountains with surface-to-air missiles painting her aircraft with targeting radar. Different stakes, same fundamental problem: getting home alive when the world conspired against you. "Show me what you've tried," she said, already reaching for the headset. Martinez exchanged glances with his co-pilot before handing over the communication equipment. As Kestrel settled the headphones over her ears and adjusted the microphone, she caught her reflection in the cockpit's side window. The face staring back looked older than her 42 years, marked by the particular exhaustion that came from carrying responsibility for other people's lives. Her silver hair, premature but earned through countless nights of mission planning and emergency landings, caught the instrument panel's red glow. Denver Center, United 749 requesting assistance." Her voice carried the clipped professional cadence that military pilots never quite lost, even after years of civilian life. Static answered her, punctuated by the distant conversations of aircraft flying in clearer skies. The storm system had created a dead zone in the communications grid, a pocket of electromagnetic interference that swallowed radio signals and GPS coordinates with equal indifference. They were alone above the clouds, with fuel enough for perhaps 90 minutes of flight time, and weather that showed no signs of clearing. Kestrel closed her eyes and let muscle memory take over, her hands finding the backup navigation controls as if no time had passed since her last combat mission. In the passenger cabin, 237 people waited in the kind of silence that comes when ordinary expectations crumble, and everyone realizes they might be witnessing something extraordinary. The businessman in row 8 had quietly informed his seatmate about the woman who'd walked to the cockpit, sharing what he remembered from news reports. Major Kestrel Vance, the pilot who'd saved a burning C-130 full of wounded soldiers, then lost everything in a scandal involving classified flight data and congressional testimony. Flight attendant Sarah Chen moved through the aisles with practiced calm, serving drinks and reassuring passengers while monitoring the subtle changes in engine sound that suggested their aircraft was no longer following a standard flight path. The pilots were deviating from their planned route, following some navigation method that didn't require GPS or ground control guidance. Through the storm, Kestrel's hands worked the instruments with the fluid precision of someone translating theory into survival. She'd learned celestial navigation as a backup skill, trained on the manual systems that predated satellite technology, but she'd never expected to use those techniques to guide a commercial airliner through a Colorado storm. "I need you to maintain heading 270 and start a gentle descent to flight level 300, she told Martinez, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "We're going to navigate by dead reckoning and terrain avoidance until we can re-establish contact with approach control." Martinez hesitated. "Ma'am, that's basically flying by instinct." "No," Kestrel replied, adjusting the backup altimeter. "That's flying by experience. Big difference." The aircraft banked slightly left, settling onto the new heading as storm winds buffeted them from multiple directions. In her mind, Kestrel constructed a three-dimensional map of the Colorado airspace, plotting their probable position against the terrain features she'd memorized during countless hours of flight preparation. The mountains rose like sleeping giants below the clouds, their peaks invisible but precisely known through years of studying aviation charts. Every pilot learned the theoretical basis for manual navigation, but few had ever applied those skills in actual emergency conditions. Kestrel had, over the mountains of Afghanistan, where GPS jamming and equipment failure were occupational hazards. She'd brought damaged aircraft home by reading the stars and calculating wind drift, by recognizing the subtle changes in engine performance that indicated altitude and atmospheric pressure. Now she applied those hard-earned skills to saving a plane load of civilians, her reputation forgotten in the face of immediate necessity. The storm began to thin as they descended through 28,000 feet, the worst of the electromagnetic interference falling behind them. Kestrel watched the radio displays flicker back to life, catching fragments of transmission from air traffic control centers trying to locate their missing aircraft. "United 749, Denver approach, do you copy?" The voice crackled through speakers with the urgency of controllers who'd been tracking a transponder blip that had vanished from their screens. Martinez reached for the microphone, but Kestrel was already responding. "Denver approach, United 749, we're approximately 40 miles northwest of your position, descending through flight level 280, requesting vectors for approach." A pause. "United 749, we show you well off your filed flight plan. State your intentions and pilot in command." Kestrel glanced at Martinez, who nodded grimly. "Denver approach, we experienced complete navigation failure due to severe weather. Emergency situation, requesting immediate vector to nearest suitable airport. Aircraft is being navigated by Major Vance, military aviation specialist." Another pause, longer this time. In the background of the transmission, they could hear controllers coordinating emergency procedures, clearing airspace, preparing ground crews for a potential crisis landing. The name Major Vance circulated through the communications center like a spark in dry kindling. "United 749, roger. Vector heading 180, descend and maintain flight level 240. Be advised, we're scrambling emergency equipment. Can you confirm aircraft status and souls on board?" "Aircraft is stable. All systems operational except navigation. 237 souls on board. Fuel for approximately 1 hour 15 minutes. Kestrel's voice carried no trace of the emotional weight she felt, translating a plane load of lives into the clinical terminology that emergency responders needed to coordinate their efforts. Below them, the lights of Denver began to emerge through breaks in the cloud cover, a sprawling constellation of civilization that represented safety and solid ground. The airport's approach lights painted parallel lines across the darkness, guiding aircraft home through the night. But they weren't home yet. Kestrel knew that the most dangerous part of any emergency flight was the final approach, when accumulated stress and system failures combined with the complexity of landing procedures to create opportunities for fatal mistakes. Her hands remained steady on the controls, but her mind raced through the procedures for an emergency landing with partial instrument failure. The aircraft descended through layers of cloud and turbulence, following the vectors provided by ground control, while Kestrel monitored the backup systems that would guide them to the runway. Outside the cockpit windows, lightning continued to flicker through the storm clouds, but ahead of them lay the promise of runway lights and emergency vehicles waiting in the darkness. Martinez worked his radio with the mechanical precision of a pilot focused entirely on the task at hand, coordinating with approach control, while his co-pilot ran through emergency checklists. But both men were acutely aware that their passenger had taken operational control of the aircraft, her decisions guiding them through the final phase of an emergency that could have ended in catastrophe. In the cabin, passengers pressed their faces to windows, catching glimpses of city lights through the storm clouds. The atmosphere had changed subtly, the nervous chatter replaced by the focused silence of people who sensed they were witnessing something remarkable. Flight attendants secured loose items and prepared for a potentially rough landing, but their movements carried confidence rather than panic. Kestrel's reputation might be complicated, marked by headlines and controversy, but her competence was undeniable. She'd taken command of a crisis situation with the quiet authority of someone who'd faced worse emergencies and brought everyone home alive. The approach lights of Denver International Airport appeared through the windscreen like a river of light flowing toward the runway. Kestrel made minute adjustments to their descent angle, compensating for crosswinds, and the aircraft's slightly elevated approach speed. Her hands moved across the controls with the fluid precision of someone translating years of training into life-saving action. United 749, you're cleared for emergency landing runway 34 left. Fire and rescue standing by. The controller's voice carried a mixture of professional competence and human concern, the acknowledgement that they were guiding home an aircraft full of people whose lives hung in the balance of the next few minutes. Kestrel keyed the microphone one final time before landing. Denver approach, United 749 on final approach. Thank you for the assistance. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of gratitude from 237 passengers who would soon walk away from an emergency that could have become a tragedy. The runway threshold passed beneath them like a finish line, concrete and steel rising to meet the aircraft's landing gear. Touchdown came with the satisfying thump of tires gripping pavement, followed by the roar of reverse thrust as Martinez brought their speed under control. Emergency vehicles paced them down the runway, lights flashing in the darkness. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, Kestrel removed her headset and leaned back in the observer's seat. Through the cockpit windows, she could see ground crews approaching with the organized efficiency of professionals who'd drilled for exactly this scenario. The storm continued to rage above them, but they were safely on the ground, all souls accounted for. Martinez turned to face her, his expression mixing relief with professional respect. "Major, I don't know how to thank you. That was exceptional flying." Kestrel shrugged, the gesture carrying decades of deflecting praise that felt unearned. "You did the hard part. I just helped with navigation." But her eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there at the beginning of the flight, the satisfaction of a job well done and lives preserved. The passenger cabin erupted in spontaneous applause as the aircraft came to its final stop, the sound carrying through the cockpit door like a wave of gratitude. Somewhere in that applause was recognition, not of scandal or controversy, but of competence applied when it mattered most. As ground crews positioned stairs against the aircraft's door, Kestrel gathered her paperback novel and prepared to resume her interrupted journey to nowhere in particular. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt like a pilot again, carrying the quiet satisfaction that came from bringing everyone home safe. The newspaper headlines the next morning would focus on the dramatic rescue, the emergency landing, the passengers who'd applauded their unexpected savior. But they would miss the most important part of the story. The moment when a disgraced former military pilot rediscovered that some skills transcend reputation, and some responsibilities matter more than past mistakes. Major Kestrel Vance walked off that aircraft carrying herself with the unconscious dignity of someone who'd remembered what she was truly capable of when everything depended on getting it right. The Denver Post's aviation reporter managed to catch her in the terminal, notebook in hand and questions prepared about emergency procedures and manual navigation techniques. But Kestrel simply smiled and kept walking, disappearing into the crowd of late-night travelers with the quiet confidence of someone who'd done her job and needed no recognition for it. Behind her, the Boeing 737 sat empty on the tarmac, its emergency over and its passengers safely reunited with waiting families. The aircraft would undergo thorough inspection, its navigation systems repaired and tested before returning to service. But for those who'd been aboard during those crucial hours above the Colorado storm, it would always be remembered as the plane that Major Vance brought home. In the weeks that followed, letters would arrive at Denver International Airport addressed simply to the lady pilot from Flight 749. Passengers writing to express gratitude, sharing stories of how the experience had affected them, asking questions about aviation and courage, and what it meant to rise to an occasion when lives hung in the balance. Kestrel never received most of those letters, having disappeared back into whatever civilian life she'd constructed after leaving the military. But airport personnel read them, filing them away as testament to a night when ordinary commercial aviation became something extraordinary, guided by skills that bridged the gap between military precision and civilian necessity. The storm system that had caused the navigation failure dissipated over the eastern plains, leaving clear skies and normal flight operations. But meteorologists studying the weather data noted unusual electromagnetic activity, the kind of atmospheric disturbance that occurred perhaps once in a decade. Flight 749 had encountered perfect conditions for complete navigation system failure, the kind of scenario that airline training programs covered in theory but rarely expected pilots to face in practice. That Kestrel had successfully navigated them through such conditions using manual techniques spoke to training and experience that went far beyond standard commercial aviation requirements. She'd applied military emergency procedures to civilian crisis management, translating combat flying skills into life-saving competence above the Colorado Rockies. The official incident report would document the technical aspects of the navigation failure and emergency landing, but it would only hint at the human drama that had unfolded in the cockpit. The passenger who'd reluctantly identified herself as qualified to help. The captain who'd trusted his aircraft to someone with a complicated reputation. The successful application of skills that bridged military and civilian aviation. Airport security cameras caught Kestrel's departure from the terminal, a solitary figure walking through the late-night concourse with a small carry-on bag and the measured pace of someone accustomed to traveling alone. She'd refused interview requests, declined offers of recognition, and quietly returned to whatever life she'd been living before United Flight 749 encountered a Colorado storm. But her actions above those storm clouds had reminded everyone who witnessed them that competence transcends controversy, that skills earned through years of training and application remain valid regardless of past mistakes or damaged reputations. She'd taken control of a crisis situation with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. The businessman from Row 8 spent considerable effort trying to track her down after the flight, wanting to apologize for his initial skepticism and thank her for her service. But Kestrel Vance had effectively vanished, leaving behind only the memory of steady hands on aircraft controls and a calm voice coordinating with air traffic control through the most challenging phase of the emergency. Years later, aviation instructors would use the Flight 749 incident as a case study in emergency navigation and crew resource management. The successful application of manual navigation techniques during complete instrument failure became required reading for commercial pilots training for emergency scenarios. But they would teach it as a technical exercise, missing the human element that had made the difference between disaster and successful emergency landing. The real lesson wasn't about navigation techniques or emergency procedures. It was about the quiet courage required to step forward when lives depend on competence, regardless of past mistakes or damaged reputation. About the moment when training and experience combine with moral obligation to create something larger than individual concern. Kestrel had demonstrated that some responsibilities transcend personal history, that the obligation to preserve life overrides any reluctance to act when action is required. She translated decades of military flying experience into civilian crisis management, proving that skills acquired in service to country remained valuable in service to humanity. The storm clouds had dissipated, leaving clear skies above Colorado and normal flight operations throughout the region. But for 237 passengers, their families, and the flight crew who'd experienced those hours of uncertainty, the memory would remain vivid. The night when everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and someone with the skills to set it right stepped forward when it mattered most. Flight attendants from that crew would tell the story for years afterward, describing the passenger who'd walked calmly to the cockpit and taken control of a crisis with the professional competence of someone born to handle emergencies. They'd remember her steady voice on the intercom, updating passengers on their progress, maintaining confidence, even as she navigated them through conditions that had defeated their aircraft's sophisticated navigation systems. The co-pilot would complete his training and advance to captain rank, carrying with him the memory of watching Kestrel work the manual navigation controls with the fluid precision of someone for whom such techniques were second nature. He'd incorporate those lessons into his own emergency training, understanding that the most sophisticated technology was only as reliable as the human skills that backed it up. Captain Martinez would fly for 15 more years before retirement, but Flight 749 would remain the most memorable of his career. Not because of the technical challenge or the navigation failure, but because of the passenger who demonstrated that competence and character were more important than reputation or recognition. He'd learned that night about the kind of quiet professionalism that focused entirely on getting the job done, without regard for personal cost or public acknowledgement. But Kestrel herself remained a mystery, vanishing back into civilian life as completely as she'd emerged from it during those crucial hours above the storm. Airport security had no record of her final destination, and passenger manifests showed only that she'd boarded a connecting flight to Phoenix, then disappeared into the network of domestic aviation that carried millions of travelers to destinations across the country. She'd left behind no forwarding address, no contact information, no way for grateful passengers to express their thanks or curious reporters to ask their questions. The woman who'd saved Flight 749 had returned to whatever anonymous existence she'd been living before the storm forced her back into the role of military pilot and emergency responder.